Rehearsal, I teach a course called IST 446 here at University Park. Right now I'm the faculty programs coordinator for teaching learning with technology. So I work with a lot of faculty around projects, some of which are about educational games and creating games, and most recently working with Chris and some folks with economics on research in Econ U that you might hear about a little bit later. So this was kind of an interesting idea Chris had to have me talk a little bit about the course. And I know we have a very diverse group here, so I didn't want to just talk about the course and reflections on the specific class. I wanted to talk a little bit about the class, but then more things I've learned that both might impact game design projects that people are undertaking, how you interact with students depending on what types of courses you might teach. So hopefully there's a lot of different takeaways here today. But I do want to start off quickly just giving you an overview of what the course looks like. So IST 446, Introduction to Computer Video Game Design and Development. This class started probably about 10 or 11 years ago with a faculty member at the College of IST. She taught predominantly the Unreal Engine. So if anybody's worked with the guts of these things.
I took that class.
With Maggie?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Good class, I assume?
Yeah.
Yeah, very good class. Everybody was bummed to see her leave. So she eventually left and moved to another institution, and the class went into hibernation for about 4 years. So the students actually petitioned the dean of IST, asked for the class to come back. I started teaching it about 3 years ago in the spring, and a colleague of mine, Will McGill, teaches it in the fall. So it's ran about 5 times now, the 6th time this coming fall under Will McGill. So it's an interesting course. We teach it very similar. We have a couple differences, but generally the course looks a lot like this. It's about a 15-week course, resident. There are about 50 students. That's what it caps out at. Once we get through drop add, it's more 40, 45, usually after you get through the drop add period. There are 2 prerequisites, IST 311, this is an object-oriented programming course, IST 331, which is an information systems design and development course. So the students come in with some level of programming background expertise, at least knowing some basics and some of these different technologies we engage in this course. It's also a mix of IST and computer science kids. It's usually about a 50-50 mix, so that generates some interesting teams, because a lot of this is project-oriented and team-oriented. So we have a good mix. We occasionally get some people from business, some people from communications, but mostly IST and computer science folks in the class. There's a lot of different outcomes. I wanted to highlight some of the bigger outcomes of the course in terms of projects and assignments we go through. The first thing they do is an individual prototype. So every student is responsible for creating some sort of game. The only requirement I have for this in terms of the delivery is it's online. So whatever they make, it has to be playable online. When I didn't have that requirement, I had to download all sorts of stuff from different engines, and it was just very difficult to grade 45 individual projects that were all using different software and things along those lines. So this actually happened within the first 4 weeks. I moved this up really early in the semester, and what they usually do is they do this usually in some variety of Flash. Some choose Unity 3D, some choose some other technologies, HTML5 once in a while. But right now, most of the folks do it in Flash, and what we provide is kind of a 1-week boot camp in something called FlashPunk. It's a free Flash authoring environment, and I tell the students that if you're not comfortable doing this in the technology you already know, we'll support FlashPunk, so you can use FlashPunk for this. Otherwise, as long as it's playable on the web, use whatever you'd like to use here. So that's kind of the first 4 weeks of the semester, is getting ready for that, getting the students prepared to complete that project. As soon as that's done, we quickly configure into teams for the rest of the semester. And all the rest of these outcomes are team-driven. There's a team information document, so that's something that students hand in that kind of outlines the roles and responsibilities of each person on the team. They put together an outline of how they're going to complete the project, kind of like a project plan. The key thing here is I make them put together what I call kind of a conflict resolution plan. So should there be conflict in teams, which inevitably that happens, how are they going to handle that stuff? And essentially, I use this as a blueprint. If they come to me later in the semester and they're arguing and there's infighting in their team, I get this document out and say, okay, how did you all agree that I should handle this? Have you tried to handle it and the steps you've laid out? If not, then I have to step in and figure out some way to kind of resolve this. I've never had to use that yet. Teams usually kind of figure it out with one sit down with the team and get it back together. But it's good to have that there just in case things fall apart within the team. The pitch presentation is the first real kind of team deliverable where they actually stand up in front of the class and pitch their ideas for their game. So the way game publishing works a lot of times is if you're in a development studio, you have an idea, your team builds a prototype, you go to game publishers. And those publishers you pitch your idea to, and hopefully they will give you money and help you develop the rest of your game, help you market it, distribute it, and things along those lines. So this is a simulation of that. So when one team is presenting, all the other teams in the audience represent publishers. And they have what I call monopoly money. They have $100,000 to distribute to the games they want to see made. So it's very structured. It's 5 minutes, 10 PowerPoint slides, automatically twist every 30 seconds, transition, so it's very rehearsed. I've had people show up dressed as pirates, dressed as wizards, voice acting Vikings. I mean, the students really get into it. It's a really kind of fascinating thing to watch, and students get real excited about it. And I think part of it is that level of competition in the background. You know, there's actually a winning team who gets the most money, and that's kind of a badge of pride, that if you kind of win this kind of presentation exercise, everybody in the class believes that, you know, your game is the best idea, right? Maybe not the best game, they haven't made it yet, but it's the best idea for a game. So then we jump into a design document. A design document is a much more fleshed out from the pitch presentation. The pitch presentation's high-level ideas. Design document is kind of how they're going to actualize this. And I want to just quickly show you what one of these design documents looks like, because this isn't just kind of a term paper. This is a very artistic kind of representation of where the team's going. So this team was kind of doing gravity assist racing. Racing game takes place in space. Gravity is kind of the key mechanic. And as you can see, you know, there's an aesthetic to this. It's a very creative kind of document. They have a lot of kind of concept art embedded in this. Throughout the document, it gets into screenshots, it gets into the technology they're using, and I really stress to them, don't just put stuff in a Word doc and hand it in. You know, this is supposed to be a very aesthetically driven, artistic, creative document, because again, you want to get people excited about your idea here. So that's kind of part of where we go with this design document. And then from there we go to the completed game. And the completed game, much like the pitch presentation, I usually invite a bunch of people from outside the class in. Chris has been here, Zach's been there, some other folks have been there. And again, we do the same type of thing we did at the pitch presentation. There's a voting process. Each team gets to vote on their favorite game, kind of best of show. Everyone I bring in from outside the class also contributes to that voting. So at the end of the class, there is kind of a winning game. And I joke with the students, I haven't had any team yet win both the pitch presentation contest and the game, you know, the game of the year, so to speak, the best of show. So a lot of the people that win the pitch presentation are really excited, but I always challenge them. So far, none have won. I came close this year. The team got third that won the pitch presentation exercise. So it gets very kind of competitive again, which is interesting. And last but not least, the students are all playing one another's games as well and creating written feedback for the teams. So each team collects all these feedback, and then they have to synthesize it and create what I call iteration plans. So if you were going to keep building this game beyond the semester, what would you change based on player feedback, right? So the iteration is a key part of this, and I'm trying to figure out right now how I can move the completed game up in the semester and actually have a real iteration cycle happen in the semester. But I already have a whole lot in 15 weeks, and it's getting challenging to try and wedge all these things into the course. So one thing I do as a teacher, I use blogs a lot. I've been using blogs for about 6 years now in classes, and I think I finally have a method that works for me. So the students select one of five consecutive week spaces in the semester. That can be the first 5 weeks of the semester, the middle 5 weeks, or the last 5 weeks of the semester. In these 5-week periods, they're responsible for 2 blog interactions per week. That can be 2 entries, an entry and a comment, or 2 comments. And what that does is it really kind of drives the conversation around the course. And I have a rubric that's designed to kind of make sure that they're not just saying, yeah, I agree, thumbs up, you know, things like that. It actually has to have some substance, and they're referencing different things online. And this semester, it worked really well. I had 190 entries and 290 comments. The hard part for me is I obviously couldn't read all of that. So I rely a lot on my TA, and a lot of the entries that generate the most comments is where I tend to drive a lot of my attention where I go in the course to read a lot of these things. But this is public. If you're ever interested in just kind of reading about what 45 IST computer science kids think about video games, there's some really interesting things here. Everything about digital rights management, everything about advertising and marketing, ethics in games, violence in games. You'll find it on this blog. It's a lot of interesting stuff that students are writing about here. And at the end of this presentation, I have an URL for this if people want to check it out. I do use a textbook, Jesse Shell, The Art of Game Design. A lot of the course revolves around these 4 elements of games. The aesthetics, what's the art look like in the game, what's the sound design in the game, and how do these all come together to kind of create a feel or a tone. The most important part, in my opinion, the mechanics on the left. This is what makes games unique, right? This is kind of the affordances for the players, the way the player interacts with the world, other characters, things like that. To the right, story. Some games have a lot of story and focus on story. Other games story is almost non-existent. So we talk a lot about story and kind of its place in games. And then last but not least, the technology. What are the things, the tools, the stuff used to build a lot of these? And I think one of the reasons a lot of students like this class is that I require them to play 3 games. I call them games of the month. So January, February, and March, they're expected to put 5 to 7 hours into a game that I kind of dictate what that game is. It's usually something free that everybody can play without having to go out and buy it. And then we have debriefs that do nothing but talk about that game and these 4 elements and how these 4 elements come together in that game for good or for worse. So we spend a lot of time here on this chart throughout the semester. Has anybody ever heard of flow theory before? Flow theory?
Yeah.
Does anybody know how to pronounce the gentleman's name?
Csikszentmihalyi.
Csikszentmihalyi? Csikszentmihalyi, okay. I think I heard 2 different things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never figured it out, and apparently yeah, it's a philosophy guy from, or a psychology guy from Transylvania, I believe. Yeah, wow. Maybe that's the long name. But he talks a lot about this balance of kind of challenge level and someone's skill. He studied a lot of professional athletes at the top of their career and tried to really figure out how do they kind of get in the zone, these people that are top performers in their sports. You know, when you're so immersed in something, kind of time and place falls to the side, you lose track of your surroundings. And this is an area that game designers kind of see as the holy grail. This is kind of the main area that everyone strives for in game design, where you want people in this kind of flow zone here in the middle. Whoops. And the idea is that you're trying to make games that have a perfect balance between the challenge level the game provides and the skill level of the player. And when you can do that, you can put gamers in this flow zone where it kind of gets them so immersed they lose sense of time and place. And this is really hard to do. And the really good game designers do something that looks a lot more like this. You know, they actually push you to the very edge of your abilities and then give you a breather, and then push you back to the edge of your abilities and then give you a breather, and kind of push you through this zone in kind of a zigzag area. So this is a core part of the course as well. We talk about games and what games kind of put players in this state of mind, and then I ask them why, to reflect on that. What is it about the game that kind of gets you into this space? And it's very interesting because it's different for everyone, right? You know, different people have different tastes and different skill levels as well. So this is really different for each person. So does anybody have any questions about the course before I jump into kind of the lessons learned part?
Questions about the course? Okay. Do you find that your students are creative? I mean, there's like, you know, stereotypes of scientists and like they just robots or whatever. Do you find like a high level of creativity in the course?
It varies by team. You know, and I think a lot of it also has to do with team dynamics. If they're comfortable with one another and you know, enjoy exchanging ideas, things tend to get creative. But for some reason, the teams just aren't. You know, sometimes they're not clicking, but creativity is definitely not clicking.
Bart?
Yeah.
Sorry, my voice is gone. Is this course a required course, an elective course, or totally optional?
Totally optional.
So they don't get degree credit for taking it?
I think they can plug it in here and there as electives, but it's not, you know, it's not a gen ed, doesn't fulfill gen ed, it's not part of a curriculum in IST or computer science.
400 level IST can't that be used as a supporting course?
I don't know the answer to that. It might be. Do you think? Okay.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not totally worthless.
Correct.
That makes me feel better at least.
You know, in our program, we have a full game dev minor, and we're fleshing it out into different elements of game development.
Mm-hmm.
So we started a few years ago with a course that was very similar to this, which is kind of like the entire games industry, you know, in a nugget. What's difficult with getting that gen anything is because there's so many different topics. Yeah. I think if it boiled down and fleshed out, you'd have more luck getting like a GH or a GA or anything. So we have a GQR programming, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, like you said, it's challenging because it's everything in one.
It's a great big nugget, yeah.
Yes, it is. Yeah, multidisciplinary in a lot of ways. Yeah. There was any other questions?
I just have a quick question about team composition. You said that they vary. Are those self-chosen?
No, I do pre-assessments. So I give them, I think it's about a 6-question survey that asks them to self-assess programming languages, artistic ability, project management ability, and one or two other things. I collect that and I configure and balance composition.
300 level.
Did you have
probably had
okay.
200 to get to them.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, get into lessons learned then. And Sherwin, it was funny you mentioned creativity. The first lesson I learned is students in general don't know how to brainstorm. Sitting around and just bouncing ideas back and forth, it's kind of low-level brainstorming. And I wasn't happy the first time I taught this about the level of ideas that were coming out of student teams. So I started to really look at brainstorming. And sure enough, there's bodies of literature, there's methods of brainstorming, kind of ways you can facilitate this. So now I start to show up at class and talk about the brainstorming process. No idea is a bad idea, capture every idea on paper. It really helps if you have things like Post-it notes where you can collect ideas and categorize and quickly move and combine ideas. And I bring all sorts of stuff. I bring flip charts, I bring markers, I bring tape, I bring Post-it notes, I bring all this stuff to the class, and almost for a week I cut them loose. And just go around and make sure that ideas are, being generated and see what ideas they like, what they don't like. And most of the time, it's not one person's idea they go with, it's a combination of 2 or 3 people's ideas that they can quickly rearrange, and then they have that aha moment that, okay, so we're just not going to build Bart's idea of the game, we're going to build this team's idea of what we want to do this game. So I learned that really early on, and the ability to kind of explain what good brainstorming is and then give them the tools to do this kind of stuff has really helped a great deal. Quickly after brainstorming, we move into paper prototyping. Jesse Shell, the author of this book, talks a lot about when you come up with an idea, probably the worst thing you can do right away is go to the computer and start to code it. You might end up wasting a lot of time, right? Because your idea might be a stinker, Yeah.
You mentioned tools just a second ago, before you leave that too far in the back.
Mm-hmm.
When you speak of tools, are you speaking specifically to the ability to kind of conceptualize methods and so forth, that sort of thing, or do you also give them iPad apps, mind mapping things, and say, let's apply some of this, create collaborative teams in that sort of space?
We have not done that yet, and I've been thinking about how we could use mind mapping kind of things, but right now the tools are the rudimentary, different colored markets, Post-it note, it's much more of those kind of tools. I would like to try and figure out how to get to that next level, though. So paper prototyping, Shell kind of talks about being able to test your ideas on paper first, and then when you go to code, when you go to prototype, you're going to have a much better idea on what systems work and what systems do not work in your game. And I have just a couple of quick videos here I want to jump to that kind of illustrates what some of the students do in the class. So this team here, right now, they're kind of working through a level design question. They're trying to figure out what kind of level do they want to have set up. And I muted the volume here because there's some narration, but I'll speak for them for the next couple seconds. So they're looking to put together this level, trying to figure out how it's designed. This is kind of a shooter game, and they're figuring out, what sort of obstacles we want in place, what sort of enemies do we want on the map, different level design kind of things. And then after they go through a couple iterations of designing the level, if we jump down here further, now they're actually able to look at things like pacing. So one student is moving all the enemies, another student's moving the player. They're looking at sight lines. Evan in the back is holding up that piece of tape, and that's the distance in the sight line the player has to kind of attack enemies. And they're trying to figure out kind of the pacing of the combat here. Our level's going to be done really, really fast. Do we have to speed up or slow down different enemies in the player? And by doing this, they're starting to learn a lot about the mechanics of the game that when they go to prototype, they're going to be ahead of they're going to be much further ahead. They're not going to have to program this and rehash this out over and over in code. They have a much better starting point when they get there. And there's another one I just want to quickly show. This team didn't necessarily look at pacing. This game was looking more at balance through their paper prototyping activity. So they had, the player controls 4 different kind of heroes, and all those heroes have different statistics. They have different health points, they do different amounts of damage to enemies, there are multiple types of enemies, and they all have different statistics that hang off them. So right now they're kind of walking through one of their levels, and we call this mapping it out. So if I jump ahead a little bit here, you'll start to see they're running through all this mathematics, trying to figure out, is the pacing of combat work here? Does this pace work? Are fights going to be done really, really fast? They found out their enemies were much too strong, so they went back, they rehashed all the values for all the enemies, and they're able to do a lot of this, again, on paper before they get into the actual nuts and bolts of a programming environment. So I've learned to do this as early as possible, quickly after the brainstorming activity, so they don't run in, start programming, and kind of waste time. It's never waste time. They don't inefficiently use their time, I guess I should say. Think of that way.
So that kind of brings me to like a point or a question about the project management style, right? So is that more like a waterfall kind of, like would agile project management fit into this paradigm?
Yeah, and they talk about that in their project plans from time to time.
Well, if you have to map, quote unquote, map everything out first, that kind of defeats the purpose of iterative development, right? So how if any of your students who have decided to go the agile route, how did they deal with that?
I'm not that familiar with the agile process, so
Fail early, fail often.
right.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what this is designed to do, right? Fail early and quickly.
But even with the, but I guess it depends on how much mapping you're doing, right? They're not mapping out the whole game. But
No. I only asked them to do this for one key element of their game.
Okay.
Yeah. The other stuff they do fail and hopefully fail often in the code, right? And make quick adjustments and things like that. Yeah. So this is kind of the lesson learned here is, this idea, whether it's game design or not, if you want kids to brainstorm, teach them how to brainstorm. Teach them the methods and give them the tools necessary to at least go beyond, sitting around and just belting ideas back and forth. Give them some more tools to go a little bit beyond that. And it's time consuming too. And that's the hard part. We talk about all this content you're trying to jam into a course like this, but this stuff isn't rushed. It takes a little time to get into these kind of things. So another thing, and I think we're kind of hinting at this now, is this idea of, fail early, fail often. This is from Todd Howard of Bethesda. They do the Elder Scrolls games and the Fallout games and things like that. And this whole thing is all about what he calls opportunity time. So this top bar is typically what a lot of game design and development projects look like, right? That red line, that's kind of the play line, where people get to actually play the game internally, as well as beta testers and things like that. You can see that that's probably 80% down the timeline here, if you think of this as a timeline, right? So what he pushes his studio to do, and what I think a lot of the good studios do, is they're able to push that first play marker way, way back to the left, about 40% into the timeline. And then what you have here is this idea of when you can change things, you can play it again, and you can polish. That's all what he calls opportunity time, and that's where the best things happen. That's where the best ideas happen. That's where all the iteration, once you find out what stinks and what can you make better, that's where all that stuff tends to happen in game design and development. So he really pushes for this idea of, get there as fast as you can, get a playable prototype up and running as quickly as possible, because then you're really going to get to know your game a lot better. Yeah.
But doesn't this presuppose that your students are going to come up with a really good idea? Like by giving so little time for the actual idea, you're already presupposing that the idea is good.
I have my fingers crossed. and not all of them are. I'll be the first one to admit, not all of them are good, but there's still ideas that they can implement and fulfill the requirements of the course.
It's process-based too, not product-based. Like the process is the...
Yeah, the other thing that you could probably say is every good product probably began to some extent with an imperfect idea. Maybe a not so good idea, but it was honed and refined over the course of time, so it becomes good.
And I think the whole idea of the pitch presentation versus the final game is an indication of that. The people that win the pitch never win the final game competition, because usually the winner of the final game had an average idea in the pitch. It wasn't an idea that everybody thought was great. They were able to hone it in and do better, as it goes. So this is a game, Gravity Assist Racing. I'm not going to jump out to it due to some time constraints here, but this is what it looked like in its final form. It was very well done, had some interesting art assets, good mechanics. They had it up and running like this really, really early. So in essence, they were able to just put geometric shapes on the screen and tweak things like the gravity of asteroids and how that'll impact the player, how the power-ups move around. They were able to really play with the mechanics just using something really rudimentary like this. Too many times my students sit around and say, well, the guy doing art hasn't got the art to us yet, so we can't do anything. And I say, that's BS. You can do a lot without having the art assets in here. And that's kind of one of the key things I push every year, both in my class as well as, when Stubbs and I talk about game projects, is that you can do a lot minus the art. The art can come in much, much later. And this was one of the teams that did very well, didn't win, but they had this thing up and running in early March, and the game was due at the end of April. So they had 2 months to tinker with the mechanics and kind of hash it out and make sure it felt good, it played right, and so on. So they were one of the games that had much more polish than other ones because they were able to get a sandbox up and running very quickly. So I tried achievements in my class this semester. This was something I tried to do on the blog. I essentially wanted to put achievements in there. I thought, this will be great. I can kind of guide student writing on the blog. I can hone them in on what things I want them to focus on when they're writing posts and writing comments. So what I did, I sat around with my TA. I came up with my own list of kind of 8 innovative games over the last probably 20 years. Came up with 5 industry leaders and about 5 technology innovations pertaining to games. And my TA and I held this in Angel, and we kind of hid it from the students and said, okay, whenever a student writes something that mentions one of these, we're going to give them one of these achievements, this little graphic on the bottom here. And each of these categories had its own logo. Plug this in on the top of their entry. And in my mind, I was like, this is going to be great. They're going to be intrinsically motivated to write about certain things, because this wasn't part of their grade, right? This was just a way I was trying to guide the writing. And I was like, this is going to be awesome. I'm going to go write papers about this, do all sorts of interesting things. And it totally tanked. It was a disaster. Students didn't care, essentially, what it boiled down to. And I asked about the grades. I said, well, should I grade it? And they said, no, you shouldn't grade it. It just needs to be a better designed system. So they came up with different kind of things. And when I really thought about it, it was what they advised was much more like achievements in real games. I kind of cooked up my own half-baked idea of what it would look like, but they wanted things that looked like achievements in Halo, in World of Warcraft and things like that. The first being open and visible. I kind of held these behind the scenes. So they said, we know you said there's achievements. We know you told us these kind of 3 categories, but we don't really know what they are. You haven't given us enough information. We need to be able to see them and see kind of what the achievement list is per se. And that goes to goal-oriented. If they could see them, they could say, okay, I want to shoot for achievement 1, 2, and 4. It gives them an idea of kind of what they want to aim for. And they sort of give me ideas. Maybe something is like receive 10 comments on a post. Maybe that's some sort of like comment king or some fancy name for achievement like that, right? So they said it needs to be much more open. That way we can approach it as a very goal-oriented activity. And finally, they can't be exclusive. They have to be non-exclusive. So right now, if somebody mentioned Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, which was on my list, I knocked that off and nobody else could get that, right? And they said, that's not the way it should work. Everybody should be able to attain these things. It shouldn't be a list that you're checking off in the background. So I have a much better idea of next spring how to better approach this and hopefully, add a little bit more design to it to make it a little bit more successful. And one of the things too that I've learned, and I don't think this is probably common knowledge, people hate tutorials. When I ask students when we start to play the games of the month, they always come in after they play the first time and ask me questions about the control schemes, navigation. I said, well, didn't you look at the tutorial? No, I didn't look at the tutorial. So that's stupid. Why would I do that? So, well, you're asking me questions, so whatever. They get really frustrated about tutorials. They don't want to engage in them, and they expect the game to teach them as you play the game, right? So again, going back to some of the stuff Todd Howard talks about, and Jesse Schell talks about this too, the rule of the loop, this idea of not just at the beginning of the game, but throughout games. You're often, as a player, given something to learn. This might be a new ability, a spell, something. You're given this thing to learn, and you're given kind of a safe place to learn it in. You're given kind of like a play environment, somewhere that's very simple, non-threatening. It's a very easy way to learn how to master this new ability you perceive. And then from there, then they push you, right? Then the game forces you to overcome some challenge. Have you mastered this ability? The game's going to challenge you and figure out if you've mastered it. And if you have mastered it, not all games do this, but the good ones do, it gives you some sort of surprise afterwards. It shows you an even new or unique way to use this special ability or power that you perceive. And as gamers, you're constantly doing this loop. You're constantly running through this. And coming from an instructional design background, I immediately think of instructional design when I see things like this. This is just good instruction, right? Give something new to someone to learn, let them practice, assess it somehow, give them a challenge, and then spin it to something else. And a lot of this is scaffolding too, right? Once they master, ability 1, give them ability 2. Do the loop again. Ability 3, do the loop again. So a lot of this kind of stuff, I talk about their games, If you're really going to do a game well, try and make sure as you introduce new things, you're thinking about this loop and putting players through the loop here. And the best example is Half-Life 2 that people reference here. One of the things, if you've never played this game, it was the first game that really allowed kind of like a physics sandbox. You have this device called a gravity gun that you can pick things up, fling things around, do different things with. And you get this probably 20% through the game, and this character that's hanging out with you says, hey, go check it out, go play around in this room, there's all sorts of things here. And then this giant robotic dog wants to play catch with you, and you have to learn how to, catch things, throw things, and you're playing with this dog. And then finally the enemies find you and you have a challenge. You have to use this thing to get up into an air duct and get out of the room. And the game's constantly doing that, and the rest of the game surprises with how you use this device. But it's constantly putting you through this loop with things like this, which is a good example of the loop that Todd talks about. So the thing there, I don't think, again, this is very new. Embed tutorials and gameplay. We talk about Econ U a lot, and sometimes the students say, well, we wish we had a tutorial, and then you put it in and say, do you look at it? No. So it's a tough balance to try and figure out here. One last thing about spending habits. I ask my students every semester about how they spend money related to games. The business model of kind of going to Best Buy or going online and spending $60 for a game is still probably the prevalent model, but more and more models are emerging, so there's a lot of people playing with different models to make money in the game industry. So I usually ask them things about microtransactions, these things you can spend, under $5 on. And I ask them things like, would you spend a couple bucks to have all the unlocks available in a game like Call of Duty? So this is a game that the more you play, the more things become available to you. The more abilities, the more weapons, all sorts of things. And most students say, that's kind of cheating. I don't think I would do that. And then I asked, what if you were playing like a game like World of Warcraft? Would you pay a couple dollars to have your level raised from 1 to say 30 or 40, just for efficiency? Again, it kind of feels like cheating. I don't think I would do that. Not many people raise their hand. And then I asked about, would you buy, a specific spell or ability in a game? Again, no, it doesn't feel right. And then would you buy unique animation or something that's aesthetically driven? And everybody says yes. Yeah, they said that is what I want to buy. That's what I want to spend my money on. And I don't know, for me it's mind-boggling. I kind of joke with the students that when you're a student, you usually have a lot of time and a lot of time and not a lot of money. So you can go through a lot of this stuff. And I kind of say, hopefully when you graduate and you're in your professional life, you'll have a lot of money and not a lot of time. And then maybe you'll spend money on these efficiency things, I'm not sure. But right now, none of them want to spend money on that. They want to spend money on things like this. This is a character from a game called Defense of the Ancients. On the left is what everybody looks like. But if you drop 18 bucks, you can look like that guy on the right. Now I think that's a lot of money for this. I don't know how well this specific example sells. But people are charging anywhere from $2 to $3 up to $20 just for aesthetics. And people really seem to gravitate towards it. Oh yeah?
Yeah, it just occurs to me, it gives me a little bit of confidence in I guess, human nature. If people are saying they wouldn't want to do that because it seems like cheating. Because if you apply that to educational gaming, essentially what the precedent we would be setting is saying, can I look like I know more than I actually do? Because that's the point, right? It's to demonstrate what it is that we know, and it's to gamify the learning process. And if you didn't actually learn it, why should you be able to represent that you know it?
Yep.
So I think it's good that the ability to cosmetically change things as long as the substance underneath isn't misrepresented.
Changed, right, or you can skip, things like that.
It's like $30 for Frostfire Ezreal on League of Legends.
And they must be making money on that.
World of Warcraft makes millions off of selling like mounts and pets,
Mini
like
pets.
10 to 25 per pop.
Yes. Blizzard released a special mount several years ago, something you can ride around in the game Warcraft, and I think they made, in the first 4 hours, they made something like $5 million. Just staggering. Staggering.
So there was a game, I think, does it make Diablo?
Yeah.
There was some sword that there was like one of them in the whole game. And this was years ago, this was probably like 2 years ago or something. And some guy got it, I guess early in the game when they let it out. And I think he was selling it on eBay. And he got a good amount of money for it. So I think even though most of your students probably answer that way, it's probably a niche market, but I mean, there are definitely people who will they'll pay instead of doing the work.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's the example of like Korean pay-to-win games, versus something like Path of Exile, where you're just paying to make your fire spell look cool.
It's the pay-to-win versus the pay for aesthetics. Right. And there's money to be made in both places, which depends on what people's preferences are and things like that. So this is the clear area people are willing to spend dollars on.
There's a concept in marketing called affordable luxury. Actually, Apple has basically, that's their marketing, is affordable luxury and status. And I read an article last year that talked about, it was an ad age, that talked about that concept of gaming, about aesthetics, because it almost becomes like a status symbol. If you're the, the guy on the left, yeah, you might have the same abilities, but the guy on the right is something cooler. So it's almost implying the idea of like having an iPhone or driving a certain kind of car, but it's in the game. And it's showing up in that, which I thought was interesting.
That's ancient psychology. It's the same
Oh,
reason
yeah,
in battle
absolutely.
people wore colorful robes and things.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So the takeaway here, and this goes outside of games, I've read about message boards that do this. The more you participate in a message board, you have your little avatar that just sits next to your name, the more kind of decorations you get, the more personalization, individuality, uniqueness you can roll into things like that. I think that's a good takeaway here. And last, I just didn't want to leave everybody without mentioning the kind of game of show, or the best of show. This was a game that I think really did a good job in terms of putting people in that kind of flow channel. It was funny because usually every about 10 or 15 minutes when students sit down to play someone else's game, they'd either beaten it or they'd gotten bored and they moved to someone else's game in the class. People wouldn't get off these computers playing this game. They stayed on this team's game the entire class because it was very challenging, but it was very challenging in a good way. It had about 15 levels and it slowly ramped you up in terms of the mechanics you had to learn to get through these levels here. I'm not going to go through each of them. Let me just give you an example of kind of what, and the idea here is that Clyde, one of the ghosts from Pac-Man, was this downtrodden ghost, and he really wasn't a bad guy, and you had to kind of fight off good guys in games. Tetris makes an appearance, Master Chief from Halo, all these other good guys he has to kind of defeat throughout the game. So that's kind of how the game worked, and essentially, the mechanic really is just jumping, floating, and then you have this phase. You can phase through walls. But they don't make you do that up front, right? It's just kind of a game of moving around, platforming to start with. This is great. So you can kind of see what's going on here. But then about the midpoint of the game, you get to things that look like this.
Can you get crushed by the blocks?
Yep, this is the Tetris level, right?
Unless you phase.
Well, but the phasing doesn't get you through it all the way.
Oh, the blocks form solid.
And notice up here, death.
414 deaths.
I had to leave this one to the background to get to this point. But yeah, it times you, so it's been open 75 minutes almost. And this is essentially level 5 of about 12 or 15, so it gets radically harder than this. And I think the best someone did that wasn't on the team, they were able to beat this in 70 minutes. So they were at that computer the whole class period, and just over 100 deaths. But a lot of these students didn't want to get up. This was a game they gravitated to, and we had to kind of pull machines from other teams and say, nobody's playing your game, sorry. Because everybody at the end of the event wanted to play this game. So it was a really kind of well done, well executed game, especially from a balance standpoint. Did a really good job of making, very easy and scaling you up to radically difficult by the time you got to the end level here. Yeah.
But the aesthetic of the game is very basic, but it seemed like it was the game itself. So is that something that you find is that the aesthetic is marginal, but it's more so the game and the challenge that the game provides?
Yeah, and part of that is due to we don't have people from the College of Arts and Architecture taking this class yet. I would love if we could get more artists and animators into this, but it just hasn't happened yet. So most of these kids are programmers, and they don't necessarily have backgrounds in Photoshop and in different tools. So yeah, it's a lot of rudimentary aesthetics.
Why aren't the artists getting involved in this?
That's a good question. I'm not really sure.
Fear of programming would be my
That might be
answer.
part of it, because there are prerequisites, and the computer science kids have equivalent object-oriented prerequisites and equivalent information system development.
Ours have no prerequisites,
Yeah.
and we still have trouble getting artists. It's
Yeah.
fear of code.
Yeah.
I guarantee it is
Yeah.
fear of code.
Yeah, I would agree.
Personal data
Yeah.
collection, not backed
Yeah.
by.
Can you run it under a different code at the university and pull in art people in terms of an art class and have them
cross-referencing.
We've thought about
Ours
it.
is H&SS, and it still doesn't work.
Yeah.
Ours is run as HSS, and it still doesn't work.
And part of this is
Humanities and
personnel.
social sciences, yeah, sorry.
We had a guy in arts and architecture who we taught a 297 class together that was about games specifically to artists, but he's now at a different institution, and the interest from that department just waned.
You might even be able to do it, just thinking about my undergraduate experience as a film and video major, as like a partner class that has absolutely nothing to do with the actual game designing aspect. You just have like artists who are interested in doing art for games. They wouldn't have to do the code. Like the programmers could actually do that. Like for example, our directing 2 class, we actually had like a sister class with in the theater department with actors. So they would provide the actors, we would provide the directors, and then they would all come together. But the classes were completely separate.
Right. That'd be a great idea to try and figure out a way to do that. Yeah.
There's also a synergy of interests. The people who tend to be interested in programming also tend to be interested in video games. So consequently, if you have a dearth of programmers, you'll have a dearth of students. It's just that, unfortunate truth. We actually are in the unique situation of having literally too many programmers at our university, our college.
Right, right. That's a good problem to have, I would think. Though.
Yeah. Except you have a lot of really well-functioning, ugly games.
It's not all about aesthetics, right?
That's true.
You know, it's not all about aesthetics. Any other questions?
Does anyone make the first-person shooter type game?
Someone used the Unreal Engine in years past and done almost like in games they call it like horde mode, where a bunch of enemies are just coming at your base and you have to protect it. So we have had people try that. Those teams typically have one person that is a code jockey, somebody that's incredibly talented with different engines that does that. If the students don't have someone like that, they tend to back away. One team tackled Unity 3D this semester and made a decent game there, but that was kind of the most advanced environment people got into.
And the HTML for higher development, are a lot of people into that?
Not so much yet. I think I only had 1 or 2 individual games that people did that. A lot of people stick with Flashpunk Stencil, which is another Flash-based environment. There's a third Flash environment. A lot of free Flash environments people are using to do a lot of this. Let me jump back just quickly to put the website together here. So if you want to take a look at the games as well as kind of the blog and what students write, down here at the bottom, sites.psu.edu/IST446. This is kind of the blog that I use. Over on the right-hand side, there's categories. If you click on the final game category, you'll get a list of all 11 teams' games with links to play them, and you can check those sorts of things out. So feel free to take a look at those. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Good night.